Hello and welcome to Who Needs Western Civ, a podcast about liberal arts and classical education. I'm Clay Green, and today I'm joined by Professor Jill Ingram. Jill Ingram is professor of the humanities at the University of Florida. She received her PhD in English literature from the University of Virginia. She's the author of numerous articles and book chapters on Shakespeare and early modern drama and culture, as well as two monographs, Idioms of Self-Interest, Credit, Identity, and Poetry in English Renaissance Literature, and Festive Enterprise, The Business of Drama in Medieval and Renaissance England, published by Notre Dame Press in 2021. Her knowledge of early modern drama and culture is frankly intimidating. I don't think I've ever told you that, Jill, but it's true. Before coming to the University of Florida, she taught at Ohio University for 18 years. She is also working hard on the curriculum for the Hamilton Center here at Florida, one of the things I hope to talk with her about today. So thank you for being here, Jill. I really appreciate your time this morning.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's going to be a pleasure to talk to you, and I appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you. This time it'll just be recorded, so
Okay.
the rest of the world can enjoy it as well.
Okay.
Let's start with literature, which I know has been the focus of your career, like mine. What do you think is the value of teaching classic or great works of literature? We could use Shakespeare as an example, or Ben Jonson, someone I know that you know very well. What do you think is the value, and what do you think is one of the most important things for students to grasp when they begin approaching great literature?
Okay. Well, yeah, I feel that my answer is going to sound very subjective, but I feel it's actually objective. And maybe that's what everyone arguing a point feels. But it's actually, I think, just the tremendously high quality of the writing, okay, in teaching the great books, that the writing in anything that has achieved the status of a great work, by which I mean has just stood the test of time, and it's still being read, and it still is being enjoyed and has a lot to teach us. The quality of the writing, what do I mean by that? Well, that it's so accurate and it's specific to what it's trying to say. And what great works do, I think, for students who are reading them is they draw students in to attend more closely to language and thus to ideas. So, for instance, it doesn't have to be complicated language. So I think of Shakespeare. And when I'm teaching Shakespeare, I really like to slow down, do a lot of close reading, and ask the students to read lines out loud in class, and then just tell us what is being said. But once we start to do that, because of this high quality of the language, students realize, oh, there's so much more to a line that seems very simple at first. So I think of Macbeth, and there's that line when Macbeth is arguing with Lady Macbeth about whether to kill Duncan and to kill the king. And that's what, the play is about. Macbeth kills a king and becomes king. So at the beginning, Macbeth does not want to kill the king, and his wife's trying to convince him. And he says to her, I dare do all that may become a man who dares do more is none. So it seems pretty simple. These are all monosyllabic words. Everyone knows what man means. I dare do all that may become a man who dares do more is none. And so we just paused there, and I asked the students, what is he saying? And it's amazing. Their eyes just kind of, brighten, they light up, and they realize, oh, this is actually pretty complicated. And they get into discussions of what does the word become mean in that sentence, and then we realize, oh, he can become a man. He will, turn into more of a man. But then also, what does become mean in different contexts? Oh, she's wearing a becoming dress, right? So it would be becoming of him to act like a man or have that manly virtue. Oh, and does it mean virtue, or does it mean heroic military manliness? So then we pause on that. And then the final line, who dares do more is none. Is none what? Is not a man? Does it mean he's non-existent? Does he lose his manhood? Does he lose his virtue? You could spend half an hour on those two lines. And so to me, what makes these great works worth teaching is that invitation. I think that just even the seemingly simple language invites students to dig in, explore it on a number of different levels. It's almost inexhaustible. I guess that no matter how many times I teach the same text, and I'm thinking personally of Shakespeare, it's inexhaustible. There's just so many layers to unpack, and that it's always fresh. And it's fresh to the students, whether it's on first reading or 10th reading. And then in addition, when the students are reading language like that and unpacking it, I feel like it has what's like a knockoff effect or something. It's probably not the right phrase, but just an effect of then they think more carefully about their words, and they use words more carefully. And it's not always immediate, but I think just through the course of a semester, it has that accumulating effect when they've been dealing so carefully and intricately with language.
Yeah. That's a great point. That second point, I think, is especially important for us today when the humanities are so often asked to show their work. What's the practical takeaway for students? How do we justify ourselves? And I certainly agree that there's this real sense of close attention to even their own language that students can get from attention to great language. It maybe doesn't make them into Shakespeare's, but just that act of focusing on the words more and how they're put together, and the delicacies of meaning maybe help students be clearer, be more direct when they want to be indirect when that's what they want to be, but to know the difference as well.
Yeah, actually, that the point about being indirect, I think, is a really good point, because another thing about the great works is sort of the timeless quality. And yes, I am a believer in reading works within their historical context and giving some of that background information. I'm not just a close reader in terms of like new criticism, but that timeless quality, or the sense that these works, I'm thinking of Shakespeare's plays again, and sorry, I probably will just by default go back to Shakespeare.
That's fine. we can happily talk about Shakespeare. I have a Shakespeare question that came from a previous podcast.
Oh gosh.
I'll share it with you in a second.
I'm afraid. Okay. Yeah. But those timeless questions that are raised in the works, can speak to immediate concerns, and yet students don't have to then, talk in a very straightforward way or grapple immediately with, what's happening in the present day, because sometimes they're reticent to do so, or they don't want to talk about and I don't necessarily encourage that, don't bring present politics into the classroom, but they can talk about maybe personal or sensitive issues through the literature. So for instance, and even political issues. So I'm thinking about like Othello, for instance, and issues of racism in Othello. And if someone were just to take like a vulgar, like censorship approach to Othello, they'd there's stereotypical language pointed at Othello, and they call him the thick lips, and and he is damned for being a Moor, and he's given these monstrous attributes in the play. And so what you bring up, first and foremost is to students, well, how is Othello introduced in this play? Well, he's introduced through the gossiping sort of vitriol of very dishonorable characters, like Iago. And that when Othello first appears in the play, he is very honorable and he's, esteemed. And so it immediately shows Iago to be incredibly small-minded, and Shakespeare just presents that contrast. And sure, you're going to hear these racist remarks, but they're given by the most small-minded character, so you can talk about how racism can be exposed, how racism is exposed in these early plays. And yet, why do some curriculums take Shakespeare off? Well, that's, old white men, we don't want to teach that. But that's, in ways, those older authors of the great books can deal with issues like that in very subtle ways that I think can bring a more rich and textured discussion of, aspects of racism. And then students can talk about it in that context and not have to, or even like personal issues, maybe about mental health, maybe about personal relationships they're having or family issues. And they can, in a way, I'm not saying all classrooms are therapeutic in that way, but students can work through and discuss those issues in the context, talking about the issues in the play, and they don't have to be confrontational in a personal way, about their own issues. So that's, to me, I started out saying why great books are valuable because they're timeless. So that's the way that I mean that they're timeless, but applicable to current students' concerns in the current day.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Jill. I mean, one thing that I've talked with various guests about in this podcast is the way that classic texts or a classical tradition has the value of being both like us and unlike us. And there's something useful in being able to talk about things that are of concern to us, but in a way that being somewhat estranged from us as well doesn't trap us in the various constrictions of the present.
Right.
So I know that you are very interested in early modern culture, early modern English culture, kind of in itself. Would that be right? That it is of interest to you?
Yes. Well, I will say
it's not a trick question.
No. I kind of knew you were gonna ask me something about that, because it does seem that my books are the two monographs that I published are more about cultural aspects of the literary cultural backdrops to the literary world. And it's kind of funny because it's, in a way, I would almost step away from that description just because. Okay. No, but I'm gonna, I have to own it. It's just that my love and great interest is in the art, like the language. I came to Renaissance literature because I just thought it was the best poetry that I had ever read. But I am interested in how, in the intersection of artistic creation, right, and the cultural milieu in which it has to operate. But I'm almost more interested in how the artistic creations affect the culture rather than vice versa. And of course, you can't separate the two. And but I think my books do try to explore cultural expressions more through form. So, in fact, my second book is The Business of Drama. I wanted to name it like The Poetics of Dramatic Form or something, and the publisher wouldn't let me. So it became The Business of Drama. I was kind of just disappointed in, but I was more interested in how the shape of the dramatic form both reflected, but also influenced or inflected commercial currents. So what do I mean? Well, in my first book, I was interested in the expression in plays mostly, but also in poems and some prose works of economic relationships. But what I found was, there seems to be a lot of energy in these plays around certain characters or certain moments. And they were often in sort of marketplace scenes. I mean, it happens a lot in Shakespeare's comedies. And I noticed that's when sort of the higher born and the lower born would be most mixing. And that's sort of an obvious point. Like, of course, the marketplace is always going to be a social mix of characters. But that's when they most influenced each other. And it's like, okay. And so in a way, I felt that Shakespeare was registering how the marketplace is salutary for the community. And then in all the criticism I was reading, I came up in the academy. I mean, it's still the case in English departments, but Marxist criticism was, anytime you're talking about economics, you have to be a Marxist.
Right.
Talk about just the deleterious effects of the marketplace, and it's all monopolist. Any commercial characters.
I've heard John Bunyan described as a communist in English papers before.
Right. And I, when you actually read the plays and look at those scenes, that's not the case. I mean, that's not to say that there aren't evil monopolists, and there are, of course, corrupt merchants and this and that. But for the most part, these are this sort of social mixing that occurs in the marketplace, and even the kind of tricksy characters who might be on the make in some of these scenes
Yeah.
are almost more Robin Hood characters. And
Uh-huh.
so one of the things I traced actually in both of my books was how, like, medieval drama
Mm.
that actually, sort of championed the Robin Hood character. The Robin Hood character would show up in many actual quote unquote liturgical plays, or played
Interesting.
in churchyards and things, because churches would use them to gather funds, like if they needed a new pew, or they needed, to
Okay.
repair a window, they would send around this Robin Hood character during church ales and things like that. So then I found, oh, well, that character makes his way into later Renaissance drama. I mean, sort of the drama of the public playhouse. And that's why this type of character, little thief character, or sometimes even the vice character, is attractive to the audience, because in a way it's a vestige of how those characters had to be attractive and make connections with the audience in order to gather funds.
Uh-huh.
And so that's why often the vice, not why, but that's one aspect of why the vice character often is speaking directly to the audience. Of
He's
course,
soliciting.
yes. Yes. So in a way, and that's not the only thing. Of course, evil
Yeah,
characters were attractive for other reasons, and does
sure.
not mitigate the fact that they are, evil, or that they're they are there to kind of bring down the hero, or
Yeah. Well,
sort of
like Puck
blocking.
in Midsummer Night's Dream, who's not a fully evil character, but he's a trickster character. You can imagine him at the end saying, and throw a few coins our way.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's fascinating. If you had to say, uh, do you think that Shakespeare has a more positive conception of the burgher or the merchant or the aristocrat? If I'm putting to an either or,
Mm.
when everything in literary interpretation is shades of gray. But
Well, I think
what do
he
you
has,
think?
whether burger or aristocrat, I feel like he has a real affection for and soft spot for the entrepreneur.
Oh,
So,
interesting. Yeah.
and that's like, how could an aristocrat be an entrepreneur?
Yeah.
Well, aristocratic characters can,
You could kill the rightful heir.
yes, and you can like have like enjoy your own tricksy ways, or when Hal hangs around with Falstaff, Hal has these
Yeah.
attractive qualities, but he's also really Machiavellian. And how is that entrepreneurial? Well, he's kind of entrepreneurial. He actually steals from Falstaff, and so he in himself is a robber, when of course he's an aristocrat, will be king, and he doesn't have to. But is that when he's most himself? I think Shakespeare makes suggestions about these aspects of our natural selves, that then if you have to rule, you have to set those aside.
Mm.
So I think, and the same with merchants or burghers. I think they have moments when they're um dealing with others, and they have to make true human connections, and then there's others when they decide. I think Shakespeare's much more interested in, just, that's what I love about him, he's much more interested in individual psychology, right,
Yeah.
in the development of the individual, than he is in like cultural formations, because anyone
Yeah.
can step outside, anyone, when it's required or needed, or they're in a crisis, whether it's personal or love crisis, or they're temporarily in debt. When they're in crisis mode, how do they react? And that's what's so fascinating about him, because he can explore that in someone who's king, Richard II, or Hal, or Prince Hal, and he can do it in just these, Beatrice and Benedict, or these, sort of middling characters.
Mm.
What do they do when faced with these conflicts? And or even like the porter in Macbeth, he's just a
Yes.
porter, but what's he saying and what's he dealing with? And so
When
yeah,
uh, when
individual
when when
freedom.
Cornel West was on this podcast, he brought up that same phenomenon of Shakespeare being interested in the specific individual humanity of each person. And West said it was what makes Shakespeare a prophetic figure. It was a very interesting word that he used,
Mhm.
prophetic. Um, as if Shakespeare were the prophet of individuality or something like this, people's individuality. But there is
Invention
always that
of the
question.
human, Bloom would say.
Yes, invention of the human. Yeah, that is always, when we're circling this, set of issues, you do find yourself asking that perennial question, which I think Paul Cantor, whom I know you know, called the Shakespeare fallacy, which is like, where did he come from? Like,
Mhm.
how did Shakespeare come to be?
The thing is, that's
Yeah,
the thing. Like,
yeah,
you really, and you do, if you really know the period, I think you can understand. I mean, not that he wasn't a singular genius, and obviously those exist,
yeah,
Einstein, Galileo, Da Vinci, Shakespeare. But if you really start looking at crazy medieval literature, I mean, and the just unique, funny, inventive poems, plays, tracks that were written at that time, and you're brought up in that culture. I mean, something was going on at that time. And by that time, I mean like that 200 or 300 year period, if you're looking at
yeah,
the 15th century through the 17th. And like if you read Chaucer closely, like you could say Chaucer invented it. Chaucer is hilarious and really is interested in the individual.
yeah,
Uh a lot of those medieval writers, like well, I don't know if you know, this is more early Renaissance, but Sir Thomas Wyatt, and
yeah,
then
of
16th
course.
century. So
Yeah,
but he I do think part of it had to do with the fact that of the Reformation, that
mhm,
everything that they had known to be stable for so long in terms of their religion, but also in the entire culture, is getting disrupted and
yeah,
shifted. And I think it was that combined with the fabulous public education that
yes,
even middle class kids were getting. And I say kids, and I do mean boys, because we have
right,
college. Girls weren't going to school at that time.
right.
Only the aristocratic ones were getting a great education.
I'm not
Um,
sure I would have wanted to go to an early modern grammar school.
I know. So really, I mean, if you think about the amount of stuff that they had to do, Latin double
Yeah,
translation and going to school, what, like 14 hours a day, and plus all summer long. I mean, they really did have a top-notch graduate
yes,
level education by the time they got out of equivalent
totally, totally.
12th grade or something.
Yeah, yeah.
That,
Shakespeare could have done 2 years of that, and he would, you know,
oh,
have an
gotten more.
incredible education.
Yeah, yeah. So when people say, "Oh, how could Shakespeare have written Shakespeare? He didn't, he hadn't gone to Cambridge or Oxford." It's like,
Yeah,
he probably is in some ways better educated than those who have graduated from Cambridge and Oxford today. But anyway, so that great cultural disruption,
yeah,
combined with the education, just to me, it shows up in the language. So I was thinking of Wyatt, and I think of his poem "They Flee from Me." I'm sure you
yes.
know it.
So
Um,
beautiful.
yes, and I think that's one of the reasons why I went into, got a PhD in literature and just wanted to teach.
Yeah,
The reason being, I cannot read that poem out loud and not get shivers up my spine.
yeah.
Like it's just,
I completely agree.
yeah. So the last stanza, and I guess I'm again just talking about the transformation of the language and the way the language is registering that cultural disruption. So he's talking about, they flee from me, right? The women who he used to have great success with are now all gone. And I think what Wyatt did, in some ways, he's expressing what are obviously very subjective and personal feelings about a broken love relationship, but it could also just be about, oh my gosh, the tremendous cultural
Mm,
losses, whether he had family members who were Catholic, maybe they're executed for being Catholic, or maybe he
yeah,
had family members who fled to the continent, or or who knows. I mean, someone who had been in at court and then lost favor and lost everything. But that end, when he says, "But all is turned through my gentleness into a strange fashion of forsaking," right?
yeah,
So strange fashion of forsaking, and I have leave to go of her goodness, and she also to use newfangledness. It's like, what?
I know. I know.
I ask the students, what's that word, newfangledness? And like, well, I've heard of newfangled, and he, for all I know, and I don't know this for sure, I haven't looked it up in the OED if he was the
He
first to
invented it.
use that.
Yeah.
I don't know for sure, but just that combination, that his gentleness, all is turned through his gentleness. Oh, so he was too, and the students love to say, oh, he was like nice guys finish last. He was too nice to her, but also gentility, and he was gentle, and he was of the gentle class, but then that shift into a strange fashion of forsaking. So she forsook him, but a strange fashion. And I think about, even politically, what was the fashion? Who were you allied with? And what did that mean if you fell out of favor? And Wyatt certainly experienced this. But that word fashion, it's great. And then you can start thinking about, well, if you're trying to enter a life at court, it's very important that you attend to the fashion, not just in clothing, but in behavior. And then him to say, I just have leave to go of her goodness, like, and the students like to say, oh goodness, I know what that means. But I have leave to go, just that so subtle way, to say, again, more vulgar, like he was kicked to the curb. But again, think about it in a cultural or political sense, like, oh, you have leave to go, you're not welcome here anymore. And what does that mean? It could have dire consequences if you're not welcome at court. Or, are you going to be shut up in the tower? But it has this air of, when he's talking about a strange fashion of forsaking, oh, it sounds like it's a fashion. Maybe they're at a court masque, or, and then you can start talking about the cultural events that were important at the time, and where you sort of marked your belonging to the culture. And the whole sense that the whole community was sort of beset by this newfangledness, right? So not only was this poem about a woman who maybe had gotten a new lover, and so he feels lost that way, but just the fact that everything around him is shifting and changing, and he's trying to keep up, and I just feel like language in poems like that is registering that, like, desperation to sort of figure out where you belong in this culture. Like, you're very smart and you can figure out how to fit in. You've had this great education, but everything keeps shifting. If you just want to think about it in terms of the Reformation, oh, it went from Catholic to Protestant, and then 5 years later back to Catholic. And then, oh, so you can get out your, all your rosaries again. Oh no, if then 5 years later, if someone sees that, no, you can be arrested and locked up. You can, and we know all the stories of, family members that were, I'm teaching John Donne now, and he had a brother who harbored a Catholic priest when he was at the Inns of Court. And so he was eventually taken into the Tower and he died there. So this stuff was happening all around these people. I almost think there's so much social and political disruption at the time. It does feel like similar to like modernism or late modernism in literature, where there's the literature is so rich because it's reflecting just these huge tectonic shifts in the culture.
That's there's so much there, and thank you for taking me through the Wyatt poem. I really appreciate that. That analysis, and I hadn't considered the cultural aspect of cultural change in that poem, but it's clearly there. You're totally right, and it reminds me of when Shakespeare, maybe one of my favorite little bits from all of Shakespeare, though how can you really pick, would be bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. Just amazing, and connecting so many dots there, from his own feelings to the trees to these ruined monasteries or churches or whatever they are, to the passing world. I mean, it seems to illustrate what you're saying, which is in some ways that the cultural changes are also can become a language for a more complicated heart or a more complicated mind or something like this on the part of the authors. You were saying that, or one of the implications I took from what you were saying is that this great cultural shift also, is coincident with or drives or whatever with a shift in language, which also a more complicated or subtle language, which also is reflective in a more complicated or subtle mind or personality or something like this. There's this sense in which, this really is a time where, um, you know, new paradigms of both language, culture, but also thought and individuality are coming into view with roots in the past. Obviously, it's not as though this is a complete break.
Yeah, and I think that that subtlety and that sensitivity, I also think it was driven by the fact that that there was such like censorship, right, and
Yeah,
control,
right,
what and such punitive, dire, harsh punishments for disagreeing with
right,
the sovereign or the government or the lawful religion at the time. And so people were forced to be so subtle.
right.
I think it's almost like the greatness of Russian literature, or
Uh,
um, because you really, I mean, at first you didn't want to piss off the czar, and then it was the communists, it was Stalin and the communist regime. So it's that subtlety that you're driven to express yourself with.
yeah,
And I just see that during the Reformation. I feel
yeah,
like that's one ingredient in why the literature's so good, or why it repays such close scrutiny.
yeah. That's a great point. I think of Virgil, the Aeneid, which is obviously a celebration on the surface. It's a celebration of Augustus's new imperium.
Hmm.
And at the same time, there's a register of something having been lost. It's hard to put your finger on what it is exactly, but
Hmm.
this new rule is both inevitable, destined, but there are losers in the situation, and the losers get a little bit of a voice too. And so there's that kind of subtle emotional uh, texture.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's draw back a little bit from literature, which, I do with reluctance, as I'm sure you would as well. Um, I know that you're hard at work on the curriculum for the Hamilton Center here at the University of Florida. And, I'm curious about all aspects of that. But I suppose I want to ask you, what do you think are the main goals that should be accomplished by a liberal arts program like Hamilton? What should a curriculum be aiming for?
Yeah. Well, I think it's just pretty basic, right? To understand the culture and the country in which students live, but by understanding its deep history. But not just history. I mean, the Hamilton Center is really we're developing a multidisciplinary curriculum. So political thought, philosophy, great works of literature in Western Civ, right? From which our government and our ideas about individual liberty were born. And that so that students can fully understand that we didn't just emerge as a republic fully formed from the head of Zeus, right? It's like
Yeah.
this Republican democracy, like how I say lucky are we, but just, I guess maybe fortunate is the word, that we live in such a society with such a government that does respect the rights of individuals, that values individual liberty and freedom and pursuit of happiness, property rights, and we have our Bill of Rights. So that's not to study the deep history of that, is to understand that it's not normal. Like
Yeah.
it is exceptional in a sense. It's not the norm. But to be educated fully in that, right? To step back and take time to understand, I guess, the debates that formed our values, that formed America's sense of civic a virtue, so that students then are become informed citizens who themselves have the ability, and this is going back to talking about studying interesting, intricate, rich language, but students who develop that ability to engage in civil debate, right? To not only understand firmly where they stand on so many issues that inform our democracy, but be able to debate others who may hold slightly different views. And hopefully our students themselves will hold different views on different sides and be able to debate, to feel confident, that they have the education in order to articulate their thoughts. I feel like sometimes students just are afraid to even engage in debate, and that's why they sort of just will fall back on these platitudes or things they hear in the media, because they don't really have the knowledge. And I mean, there's something funny I saw on the news, but someone was like, calling, and I'm not trying to protect anyone. I honestly don't know. I just saw like a glimpse. It was like a student yelling, "You are a fascist." Oh. And then the reporter came up and said, "Oh, well, who's the fascist?" And she's like, "She is." And she's like, "Well, I was just saying that. I don't really think she's a fascist, but I was just trying to get everyone to cheer the same thing." And then like, it's good for community building.
Yeah.
And then the interviewer said, "Well, what is a fascist?" And so, well, I don't really know the definition of the term, but I was just, I just wanted us all to cheer the same thing. So I thought, wow. I mean, but I mean, yeah. So to truly be steeped, even if it's just like a dabbling, I'm not saying they have to read all of Locke, but just to understand, to have that sort of general background in Western civilization, to understand where the ideas of central tenets of freedom and equality came from. Locke, Montaigne, Hume, Rousseau. And also through reading literature. We were just talking about Shakespeare and the way that Shakespeare reflects the power of the individual, the importance, right, of individual thought and behavior. So you can look at Dante, Shakespeare, Martin Luther King Jr. There's just so many important examples. And to not only study, I mentioned, political thought, history, philosophy, but also religion, and just an understanding, right, of, say, books of the Bible, or how did Reformation debates help form, eventually became the American Republic. How did those debates form your thoughts on how to form a nation, what forms of government, what does freedom of religion mean? It's not something, I mean, that's what you want. You don't want students to take for granted what we have. Like, do they understand that freedom of religion is very rare? And not only throughout history, but then us versus other parts of the world. And it's not like we're, you don't have to be religious to know the importance of knowing that, it's as important for atheists to know, as believers. So, yeah.
One of the common threads that I'm hearing between your ideas about the curriculum for a program like Hamilton and our previous conversation is the importance of language. The students not understanding what the word fascist means is an ignorance of history. It's an ignorance of our language. And I think maybe that is one of the particular things that literature could offer, is by having to grapple with the history of words and the many possible significations of words, we might get a deeper grounding in the past, including the past of our own language. This relates to what you were saying before about there being inherent value for the sake of our ability to communicate. It seems to me that, what I take away from what you just said is that that's not only a kind of technical ability, but there's kind of a political or civic aspect to that as well, that it contributes to us being informed, good citizens.
Right. And actually a character aspect, right? Like, I guess I was speaking about students having the confidence to debate in an informed manner, but I think that confidence in having some knowledge can lend itself to character too, because then if you really have a sense of the issues behind which you stand, then you can stand behind them with integrity. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And really believe in what you're saying and take a stand.
Yeah.
And I think taking a stand while being informed, that has to be, one definition of character.
Hmm. Yeah, that's fantastic. Two different people that I think of. Thomas More,
Mm-hmm.
you know, he understood what it was about, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
how could he have made the choices he made if he didn't feel, integrity was linked to him knowing what he was talking about.
Right.
His sense of things was very well developed. And then, of course, me, Jill, I think also of Milton, my love, who
I
put
knew you'd
his,
get Milton into this conversation.
it had to happen, put his neck in the line, quite literally, for the sake of his, at the time, rather unpopular principles. And how could he have done that if he didn't have a very, very thorough education, and that grounded him in even things like logic, religion, uh, such that he really, again, kind of knew what he's about. So yeah, that connection between knowledge and integrity, I think, is something I haven't thought about, but I think it's really, really valuable.
Yeah. And thinking of Milton, I mean, one of the first proponents of freedom of the press, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, what a fantastic model in a time when that was just not. I
Right.
mean, I'm sure people had conceived of that, but to articulate, and to publish a tract about that, really
Yeah.
risky at the time. And
Totally.
yeah.
I always feel obliged to point out that Milton is not without some self-interest there. That he wants to divorce his wife, so he publishes a book about how you should be allowed to divorce, and then
Yeah.
somebody censors his divorce book, and so he publishes a book about how you shouldn't censor books. But I mean,
Yeah,
sometimes self-interest, there's often a mixture of self-interest and ideals in
that's right.
all human endeavors. What do you think are some of the challenges that face a program like Hamilton?
Yeah.
These could be local or broader, or
Well, it's
whatever you think.
yeah, the challenges, in a way, are very much practical challenges on the ground. So it's more like challenges of institution building, challenges of trying to develop a new center on a campus that is already populated, by hundreds of departments. But it's interesting. I thought the challenge might be getting students interested in what we are selling, in a way. And I don't mean to be pecuniary about that. I just mean
It's a classical enterprise could be the name of your third book.
I like it. I like it.
Yeah. The
But
business of education in 21st century Florida.
but the thing is, students are interested. Like our classes fill, and the honors program has been wonderful in allowing us to teach these 1-credit courses on, Nicomachean ethics and Augustine's Confessions, and these classes are drawing a lot of interest. In fact, a non-honor student wanted to take Max Gunsberg's Federalist Papers, and she said,
Wonderful.
I've heard you're teaching the Federalist Papers. I really want to take your course, but I'm not an honor student. It's like,
Oh,
it's just,
that's amazing.
I mean, there's interest there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But so the challenge has not come from students. The challenge has come, of course, I know this is going to come as a shock, but from administrators, who, one of our first meetings, I know I've told this story before. I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus by naming names, but, one of our earliest meetings at University of Florida, we were told, oh, well, I just don't think your courses are going to be successful because students don't like to read anymore. And it was, but So, I had to kind of put my tail between my legs and leave that office and think, we know she's wrong. We'll just have to prove
Yeah.
her wrong. But we do actually have, as you know, we have great support at the highest levels of administration at UF. And so it's not so much a challenge there anymore.
Hmm.
So we're more well positioned, as they say. But there's still some resistance from other departments, but it's interesting because the resistance used to be, what are they doing here? There's real no place for them. And now that we're showing that we're making these great hires and students are interested in our courses and we're developing majors, and in about a year and a half, we're going to start offering those majors. Now it's just fear that we're going to be too attractive to students and steal their majors. And perhaps that fear is well founded, but I think but really how that's manifesting now is that other departments actually want to be involved with this. Oh, can we co-list our classes? Or maybe you can tell your students who come into the Hamilton Center to take classes in our department. And yes, we're encouraging that too. In fact, in developing a great books major, I have an agreement with someone in art history, and we're going to make her class a requirement in our great books major, because we don't have an art historian on our staff. And so it's a fantastic course, in like ancient and medieval and early modern art. And so that's going to be a great requirement working with her. But that means, they'll have so many more students once our majors get rolling. So it's just sort of practical on the ground, sort of winning the hearts and minds on on the campus of University of Florida, but it's not a challenge to win the students, which I think is going to be wonderfully successful, but more so other departments and some administrators.
Yeah, that's great. I think that the other departments are pushing to get their courses cross-listed with Hamilton. That may be the best thing I've heard in months.
Right. Yeah. Well, it was not effortless.
Right. So as we begin to wind things down, I have just one more serious question. What do you think that civilians in this academic, I don't want to call it a war, this the modern academic situation, people who are interested in programs like Hamilton, how can they help out? How can they encourage similar things maybe in their state universities, or encourage or support programs like Hamilton? What do you think?
Right. Okay, well, if you live in Florida, encourage your friends and family to apply. Just become students at the University of Florida, which of course is a fabulous university, and
best state university in the country.
Yeah, and take our courses and join the Hamilton Center. If you're and also in Florida, but in these other state programs, right? Texas, Ohio, Arizona, Tennessee, North Carolina, they're all developing centers like this. Just talk to your local and state politicians, right? Support those state politicians who support it, because these are often linked through the legislature, and often, as the Hamilton Center was, a result of a legislative mandate that funded us. So we need that civic support, right? Voters matter. Encourage your state senators to support these programs. In Florida, it's Keith Perry. I think Keith Perry is a state senator who's been very supportive of the Hamilton Center. So yeah, that's what I would say, because this is a political movement in a way, just not in terms of like Republican or Democrat, but it's political in the sense that parents and students too, in high schools would like to see programs like this and take a certain kind of course that is it's just becoming rare. To be able to read the great books and study civic education.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the political issue. Maybe you could just take a moment to reassure people who have the suspicion that this is some kind of right-wing propaganda machine. It clearly isn't, right?
Yeah. It's an educational program,
right?
And we're not sending people into, to go fill Republican or libertarian,
Yeah.
offices or work for those
Yeah.
politicians. It's not that kind of scheme. And in fact, we do have a Hamilton Center Fellows program. So that's a fellowship program for students here at Florida that apply, and then they're just involved. They help out with our public talks. They have a weekly reading group where they read a great work or two with our associate director, my husband Robert Ingram. But then they also get paid, and I forget how much the fellowship is. Do you remember? It's like 2,000. I'm gonna
I'm
give
not
it a
sure.
but
Yeah.
they also, in addition, get a free trip to Europe, to England at the end of the semester, where they go
Yeah.
and they take seminars that have been set up with professors at Oxford and Cambridge, and also go see a play in London, and go through museums and get tours. So that's a fabulous program. But what that has to do with us being non-partisan is that there's no requirement for political beliefs, and I think it's about 50-50. And
Yeah.
we don't even really know like the political valence of the students who apply, but we do know that there are some campus like Democrats or people that are really like politically involved with causes that may not seem like immediately friendly to what the Hamilton Center is doing, but these particular students are interested in reading the great works. Like, oh,
Yeah.
I've never tested. I'd love to read Aquinas, or gosh,
Yeah.
I'll read Montaigne, and I'd love to go to Europe,
Yeah.
the end of the semester. But what's great about that is then you have these fantastic discussions from both sides of the political spectrum. And I say both, I mean, it is kind of, I'd
Yeah.
say all sides.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to model, right? In the classroom, in our public talks, where we so much are embracing and trying to educate on a civil debate between people who do not agree. That's what we have to build back into our culture, right? If you don't agree with someone, don't demonize them, and don't not associate with them. You want to associate with them even more, so you can defend your point of view and ask them, find out where they're coming from. And you may leave the discussion still disagreeing just as much as you did before, but you probably learned a little bit more about their background, why they hold the beliefs they do. And maybe they've heard more from your side, and it humanizes the debate, right? So it's not just these opposing sides holding each other at arm's length, but you're getting an insight, right? And you may not totally empathize with their point of view or relate to it, but you will learn more about it, right? And feel like, okay, we are one republic, out of the many one, and we can discuss our differences.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Jill. And I want to underline the point that whatever left, right, center, upside down, whatever, Hamilton Center would be a great place for you. It reminds me of something that C.S. Lewis said actually about poetry. He said something to the effect that whatever is your entry point into European poetry, if you pursue that interest, you'll end up everywhere. You'll end up interested in everything. And I've certainly found that to be true. And I think likewise for people who have deep interest in politics, deep interest in ideas, you will eventually, I think, if you pursue that, you'll be interested in all of it. It'll all interest you. You don't need to worry about there being forbidden zones or this kind of thing. Right. As Milton said, to the referring to scripture, to the pure, all things are pure. Everything's available and should be taken seriously, and that's part of what a program like Hamilton is about. It's an invitation to a dialogue.
Yeah, 100%.
So I really appreciate your time here, Jill. It's been a real pleasure for me. I usually close with a silly question of some kind or another. I'm tempted to ask a Hamilton musical question, but I didn't prep you for that, so we don't have to go there.
I've never seen it. I mean, I've listened to it. My daughters have had it on the radio. I've never been.
Oh.
Have you seen it?
Yeah, I saw it in Toronto when I was there for the International Milton Symposium. Uh,
Hmm.
Myself and a friend caught it, and I adored it. It was fantastic. It's now on my workout playlist. Uh,
The songs were addicting. I
yes,
found myself humming them
they
along.
they definitely are. So I promised that I would ask Greg McBrair's question. I'm sure you'll answer it handily. Um, do you think Shakespeare wrote plays also expecting them to be read as well as performed?
Okay, so at first I thought you were going to say, "Do you think Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare?"
Oh,
And I was
no, yeah,
I have to punch
that's
you through the screen. Um, Meant to be read. Yes and no. So, he himself was never interested in publishing them, and he himself, I mean, having them printed, and he himself was never interested in having his poems printed. So, his sonnet sequence was just circulated amongst friends and then was published after he died. But the printing industry for public theater fare was pretty robust at the time, and so I would say that as a businessman, and I don't know his opinion on that, right? I don't think we have, as far as I know, we don't have any evidence. He, unlike Ben Jonson, he himself was not very aggressive as Johnson was in having a collected works and making sure that it was printed during his lifetime. But I would think that maybe in those smaller, like, pocket, not folio, but like a quarto version of the plays that sometimes people could pick up at the print shops or the shops around St. Paul's Cathedral. That just for the purpose of making the Playhouse more popular and more successful, I'm getting back to the cultural and economic backdrop to his business affairs, since he was a sharer in the Globe
very
Theater.
successful businessman.
Yeah, so that means, for those who don't know about what a share is, just like basically a part owner. And so he got part of the takings of each of the receipts of each
He had points on the back end, as we would say today.
yeah. Because also, there's a lot to do. You had to buy all those shares, had to go in and buy the costumes and pay the actors, and if there was a something that needed to be repaired, it was a business like anything else. And so I'd say for that purpose, he probably would have, like, if someone came to him and said, "Hey, we want to put together quarto of this, of Henry IV, and go, we're going to sell it such and such." But it's interesting because there's no copyright at the time, so it's like sort of anybody could do that. I do think that shares, sometimes I have heard of, if there are things they didn't want printed at times, they could stop it. Like if they didn't want, because they would think someone might steal their play script and then go
Right.
perform it like in Coventry or something, and be, make a profit from that. So I think that financial interest could have gone both ways.
Yeah. 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 Thank you for that answer. I think that I think the background of the question from Professor McGrair was that there would be this kind of writing for eternity aspect that Shakespeare was doing, and I'm a little resistant to that, but I said I would defer to you, and so I think you've given a great
Yeah,
answer.
it's hard to know
Yeah,
because, well, we just don't have any evidence about that, but we know that other authors were aggressive in getting their certain either poems or plays published during their lifetime, and he was not.
yeah,
So I want to say, here I am making a case for him as a business person,
yeah.
but I think it's because at that time, although you're making an interesting distinction, and I know we're closing up here, so I'll try not to
No, no,
open up
go for it.
a can
No,
of worms, but the
this is
question
the
does
fun
make a
stuff.
distinction between the financial profitability of
Yeah,
printing something versus the the significance for fame, right?
Yeah, right. Which he's
yeah.
clearly conscious of from the sonnets, right?
Yes. In terms of the content of the sonnets, but then he didn't want them printed during his
Right.
lifetime. But it'd be so
Right.
interesting to know if he did things to ensure that, a certain like fair copy of those sonnets were preserved, which they clearly were, but we don't know why. I mean, who protected that, who kept them together, and then so
Yeah, we don't have a statement from Shakespeare like we have from Milton, letting us know that he plans to leave something so written to after times that they should not willingly let it die.
right.
Yeah.
And it took other people. Was it Ben Jonson who wrote that Shakespeare was not for an age before all time, and
Right.
writing those kinds of elegies. Yeah, but clearly, as you say, in the text of both his poems and things he said in the like at the ends of plays, or things that he had in the very final lines, it's clear he was interested in it, but we don't have the practical evidence in terms of printing.
And he clearly, writers he knew very, very well, was clearly very conscious of their influence. Terence, Plautus, people like this, they were very old, right? He was aware that plays could survive.
Right. And he certainly benefited, right, from having the written copies of things written hundreds of years earlier for available to him. Yeah.
Right. It's hard not to think that he would know that would be possible, but maybe he didn't make any plans for it, or maybe he did.
Right.
Hard to say. Do you?
I'm sure we'll discover that. Like there'll be some amazing discovery in the next 100 years.
Well, maybe it'll be like our discovery of Milton's first folio, where what we discovered is that Milton is really pedantic. It's like we already kind of knew that, So I should. There are friends of mine who would be screaming right now because they're publishing articles as I speak on that on that book. Oh, well, thank you, Jill. This has been so much fun. I really appreciated the time. So
it's wonderful. Yeah. So let's have more discussions. I don't know that I want them all taped like this, but
sounds good.
Maybe soon over pizza or something.
Love it.
Okay, great.